Hey everybody, welcome to Marching Arts Education. I'm Sam Hinton, the beast of the marching arts, and we have such a great, very important conversation tonight about physical and mental health of students and band directors or any kind of directors. This is going to be really helpful. With me tonight, two ringers, everybody really know what they're talking about. Dr. Elliot Cleveland is here. Elliot, how are you?
I'm doing great, Tim. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. And Dr. Adam Gallenberg is here also. Adam, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Thank you guys for being here so much. So we're going to be talking about lots of interesting tips and information that you can use, especially if you're a director and you want to help your students have conversations around mental health or certain issues going on. There's going to be advice here that you can use, very actionable stuff. So it's going to be very, very helpful. So Elliot and Adam, I think people know who you guys are. Of course, the great work you're doing at Marching Health and otherwise, but why don't you just introduce yourselves briefly? Elliot, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I am Elliot Cleveland, Doctor of Physical Therapy. I have work with a concierge physical therapy practice in South Carolina, and also am the founder of Marching Health, where we are the global leader at this point. We can say that. It's amazing. The global leader in marching arts, health, and wellness education. We have done over 150 clinics across not just the U.S., but we've gone international. We've done multiple countries at this point where we deliver the latest in physical preparation for marching bands. And what I'm excited about now is we've shifted gears and really started slowly and are now building into adding a mental health and mental performance piece to the preventative work and the education that we do for performers and directors alike. So that is why Adam is here. Dr. Adam, give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, well, it's great to be on the podcast with you all. Yeah, I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Minnesota. Our private practice up here, Premier Sports Psychology. We work with plenty of businesses, organizations, as well as teams at the university level, high school level, as well as professional Olympic teams as well. So most of the work around sports psychology is around working with athletes, and yet with sport and performance, that includes the arts, that includes executive coaching. So it was truly a blessing, and Elliot, I'll probably have you share that story on how we got connected. But when that started, it was just this idea of how do we bring all the mental skills training and that mental health approach that we've done with athletes to performers as well. Because what we know about the marching arts is there is that physical component that's so important, and that education that Marching Health has been doing. I was just thrilled to be able to jump on board and collaborate with the team there, where we're able to provide that holistic approach to holistic health to these groups across the country and now internationally as well. So it's glad that we're able to have this conversation today.
Yeah, and if you have not seen our combo work before, basically Marching Health started when I was teaching drumline locally in the state of South Carolina. I'd worked with a couple of high schools and independent groups, and was working with Wando High School as well specifically. And just in the marching band and drum corps space, I saw the major need for increased focus on injury prevention, increased focus on strength and conditioning for members so that they would go into seasons with their bodies physically prepared for rehearsal. But also from a macro perspective, how do we start educating members about their entire health? What do they need to eat? What shoes do they need to have on their feet? How do they adapt their bodies to the heat prior to showing up for band camp or showing up for spring training? And so Marching Health got started and got rolling fairly quickly. I was very blessed to have some good mentorship along the way. And we found our way, worked really hard, and started working with Blue Coats a few summers back. And we brought in an athletic trainer. He was actually a training student at the time, athletic training student named Derek Hessing. And he interned with the Blue Coats and did some work for Marching Health simultaneously, and said, Elliot, I have a guy that you need to speak to. As Derek started to see some of the problems that were creeping up in the drum corps space. And he said, you need to talk to my buddy Adam. I said, who's Adam? He said, Adam did college marching band with me. I said, okay, well, that's something. We got a marching band guy. What else is special about Adam? He said, Adam was my roommate, and he's in, was it residency that you were in at the time?
Yep.
Okay, so I was in residency basically either the year before or the same year as Adam. And he said, you have to talk to him because he gets the sports side, the sports performance and the sports psychology. And he's a specialist in that. And that's not very common. Like that, Adam, you explain how rare sports psychologists actually are in the space right now.
It's such a young field, and I would say so our practice up here has been around for about 12, 13 years, but Premier was one of the first private practice groups that specialized in sports psychology. And at that time, maybe about like 10 years ago, maybe a handful of D1 universities consulted with a sports psychologist. But now today, probably about a third of D1 athletic departments either have an embedded sports psychologist in their department or consult with a group or a private practice for sports psych services for their athletes. So it's a very young field, but that's where there is this opening when we talk about performance in general. One group that was being overlooked regarding performance were marching groups, drum corps. And just like athletes, their days are long. They're two-a-days. They're training, being outdoors, for hours on end, on top of sectionals, on top of rehearsals. So the stressors, the time demands, the lack of sleep, the inability to have, availability to your, nutrition at home when you're on the road constantly. We were, marching band members, drum corps members were experiencing very similar things, if not, the same types of issues that other athletes at the collegiate and professional level are facing on a day-to-day basis. So being able to jump in and kind of take on this role and provide mental health and mental wellness services to these communities, it's growing, but it's a very exciting time as well.
Yeah, and we got together and started thinking of what do these performers actually need the most? What is the low-hanging fruit here to be able to give free education for? And we talked about a couple different topics together. And then right after that, the pandemic hit and everything got shut down. And Derek and Adam both reached out to me, I think, at the same time and said, the most important thing right now is probably the mental health side and the grieving side and the anxiety that we're all feeling. And so that's when we started to do the most work together. And I think Tim actually may have had Dr. Adam on pretty soon during that time, just to be able to talk to performers and get the word out and talk to band directors about losing their season, and then further what the status was during COVID for just being able to take care of yourself and give self-care and help those around you. Since then, really, I guess about 3 years ago at this point, we've slowly added getting Adam incorporated into our curriculum with marching health. So instead of just talking about the physical health and well-being, now we've added 1 hour, or even originally it was just 1 hour. Let's talk about what the most important thing to discuss with performers is, which is probably performance anxiety and how to open up mental health conversations. And we did that virtually originally, just to get our foot in the door with a couple bands. And since then, that has spawned into combination clinics where we go out and do these 2-day full workshops with school districts across the country. And I was used to marching health going in and having a large presence of people knowing who we are, and then being able to make a big impact on these students. And then when Adam came along, he already knew the band words. He knew the language and the atmosphere inside of a band room. And it was just this very natural fit for being able to reach young students on their level. So at the end of our first clinic this past summer together, I asked the students to write down 3 things that they learned the most. And of the 3, everyone, 2 out of 3 were on the mental health and mental performance side, and only 1/3 of them was on the physical health side, which was like, at first I was a little, ego shocking. Like, dadgummit, marching health isn't as important as I thought it was. Working out isn't that big. No, but I swallowed my pride real quick and realized these young people absolutely have to have more input from a mental health and mental performance side, from their instructors, from their band directors, from their parents, and from professionals like Adam. So Adam, let's talk a little bit about what we've done when we've worked with students and what we see problems being that we still need to solve and need to address in the band room.
Well, I think the first one is just the awareness of how important these topics are. So, Elliot, as you mentioned before, when we first started with some of those virtual clinics, the idea and interest was, oh, yeah, it'd be great to talk about mental wellness, mental health, mental performance. Sure, that sounds really intriguing, really interesting. And these groups would offer a 1-hour time slot. It's like, hey, we'll take it. And to your point with feedback, what we started to see right away was that 1 hour was barely enough time to even introduce performance anxiety, let alone get into mental health numbers that a lot of middle school and high school adolescent youth are experiencing at this time. And especially with the past few years dealing with COVID, losing seasons, virtual learning, a lack of in-person resources, there was no space to really have that students had to discuss their concerns or really feel like they could open up even virtually with everyone. At this point in time, virtual connections and technology, these students are walking on eggshells. Whatever they say or whatever they do online is going to be there forever, and they know this. So to open up about emotional vulnerability, mental health concerns, that was always a scary step. So when we brought in these topics initially with these groups, slowly but surely, these the band directors and the students were wanting more. And what we started to notice with a lot of our clinics, bringing in the mental performance side, it just worked so seamlessly when we would be outdoors working on very different dynamic stretches, and Elliot would run the programs for that PT work and that dynamic work out on the field, out on the parking lot, the streets, and then we'd come in and talk about how do we better that performance, how do we get our mind to buy in to those pieces to help get our body in the best position possible to perform. So the mental performance now was its own topic. And then that day 2 was a full conversation on mental health. And I think that can be really difficult for band directors, teachers, staff, where it can be really hard to know where do we draw that line? What can I say? What can I ask my students when it comes to mental health? So we would have those conversations, and I don't know about you, Elliot, but even just with these groups of section leaders or full bands or school districts that we've worked with, I've always been so impressed, and I wouldn't necessarily say surprised, but the engagement and the willingness that these young student performers would be so open about mental health topics when it was brought up in that type of environment. I mean, those days would just fly by, and we're constantly getting questions on the back end, or directors asking, like, how do we bring this to our school counselors? What would our protocol be to help make this and continue to make this a safe space for our student performers throughout the school year, throughout the season? That they know there's a need, and I think what we realized is a lot of these high school students are just wanting the space. Because when we offer that space, they're going to take it. And it's been pretty amazing to see that. And I know we have a lot coming up this summer already in preparation to continue that work with a lot of these districts.
Yeah, we know, as people within the activity and instructors and band directors, we know how fun our students can be. And when we give them an idea, they come up with some of the most creative ways to build on that idea, or creative solutions to problems that we have in the band room. And so Adam introduced this concept of a snowball fight as an icebreaker, where he had the students write down one thing that person wishes that other people knew about mental health. Or that was the phrase, right?
Yep, that was pretty much the prompt. Yep.
They just on their paper, without anyone looking, said, what do I wish I could tell someone about mental health? Then wadded it up into this super tight paper ball, and they were divided 50-50 as far as attendance goes across the room. And for 5 minutes, they had to sling these pieces of paper back and forth in an all-out snowball fight war with paper balls with that mental health secret, so to speak, in there. So by the end of it, your snowball is nowhere near you. And we actually did this with the directors and staff present and in on the activity. So they got to speak into it a little bit. And then once the timer went off, we opened it up, and one at a time just randomly picked out a student to read what was written on their paper. And so that gives the anonymous factor to it, where people are comfortable just stating what's on the paper. And we were able to get fairly deep fairly quickly and have real conversations on a mature level that were in an environment where people felt comfortable talking about it, because they knew, just like, if you're listening to this, you have your kid's best interest in mind, your student's best interest. Band leadership students and the rest of the band know that if their band directors in the room or staff members playing along with them, they have their best interest in mind. So they were willing to discuss these things. And it was really magical. Another thing that Adam did that got me and got everyone's attention right away was, he said, I want you, this is the very, very beginning of the clinic, I want you to envision your best performance of all time. Now, if you had that best performance and the sensation of performing, and why it was your best performance was something physical, go to one side of the room. Now, if the sensation of why this was your best performance was something mental, like your mindset and the clarity that you had, go to the other side of the room. And it was like 74-1 students on the mental side and student singular on the other side. That, he said his body felt loose that day. He felt limber. That was his one thing that made him feel good going into the show. Everybody else had mental clarity. So at the same time, we were able to tackle the mental health conversation on their level in a way that mattered to them, and then the mental performance side. So Adam, I want you to take us through the differences in those two and why each one, mental skills versus mental health, are so valuable right now.
Yeah. Well, I guess to start with mental health, I think, generally speaking, we see mental health as meaning depression, anxiety, mental illness, mental concerns, symptoms, sadness, isolation, withdrawal from social situations, sense of pressure or anxiety, racing thoughts. So when we hear that term mental health, I think a lot of times it becomes a topic that most people are just not comfortable talking about, or they don't really know how to start the conversation. So with mental health, what we know is, we introduce activities like the snowball fight, for example, because we all have it. Mental health does not necessarily mean mental illness. We all have mental health, just like our physical health. We all have our physical health. So how do we open up that conversation? Well, we need to be real with each other. And it can be so hard this day and age for teenagers to be real with each other. I know there's an app out there called Be Real. I get that, and that, there's those things out there. But being real with these conversations is just so difficult to start, because there's so much at risk, especially when the brain is developing in those teenage years. That risk of putting ourselves out there is really intimidating. So when we talk about the importance of mental health, it's really just engaging that conversation that it's something that we all have. So how do we reach out to others? How do we notice changes in our fellow classmates or our peers? Or as directors, how do we maybe notice those changes, that difference between sadness and isolation, the difference between feeling anxious or stressed? A lot of those words sound the same, or maybe we think of them as the same definition, but when we can really break it down, we're better able to serve the athletes or the students that we work with. So from the mental health side alone as a topic, we're really able to break it down as that difference between holistic mental wellness and also being able to address what do we do when we notice someone or when us ourselves are experiencing mental health symptoms. The symptoms where we would want to go talk to someone, or it'd be great to know the services that we have at our school or in our district or in our community. So as one, I mean, that could be a day in itself of training, not just for the students and performers, but what we've noticed at all of our marching health clinics is the directors, the staff, the leaders, the school directors, they're asking these questions because they may know their protocol for their school district, and yet how do I bring that student in to have a tough conversation, or to share with them that, hey, if you need a space, this office can be one of those spaces for you to just sit here for a few minutes, or to if you'd like to get connected to someone, we can do that here. So that's, I would say, generally, the mental health topics that we're able to bring in, whether it's, the prevention work or the crisis management work. Then on the other side, and I wouldn't really call it the other side, but then we also have this topic of mental performance, where the phrase that we like to use, with our company is, you can always better your best. So even when things are going well, even when we have our music memorized, even though we got our sets down, as performers, competitors, that competitive mindset is, we can always better our best. Things can always get better. And in those pressure situations or those competition moments, a lot of times that's when we tend to think a little bit more, or that pressure rises up, and then it's like, oh my gosh, like, do I really know my music? Do I really know my set? We start second guessing ourselves. So we address those situations and validate them. Like, yeah, it's good that the body is feeling this, because it means that you're doing something different from a practice. It means that you're doing something different from a rehearsal. It means that there's something that you feel is on the line and it's important to you. So rather than shying away from the nerves, mental performance skills training is, how do we lean into it? And I think having that mindset and kind of presenting mental skills the way that we would work with athletes, I mean, I'd say our groups, our school districts, they just gravitated towards that mentality. And even when through marching health, that day 2, we'd have section leaders run the workouts. You could even see that a lot of the mental skills we would talk about, whether it's emotion regulation or focus reframing, they were locked in. They were using those verbal cues with each other and that open communication to lock in on the drill, to know, like, hey, our section is going to be the first one completing this the right way. And then they're competing with other sections, and it becomes that healthy competitive environment to make each other better. So that mental performance side is really addressing, when we talk about our best performances, usually we're saying, oh, my confidence was just on point, my focus, I was locked in, I was just in the flow state for that performance. That's all up here. There are ways to build those skills, just like our physical health as well. So being able to bring that into the marching health world has just been a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, and I feel like both of those complement one another. And I love the phrase used earlier that we all have mental health, because that helps to break the barrier down with that. But I would imagine when we're in competitive environments, whether it's competitive drum corps or competitive marching band or professional football and UFC that you're into, it's easier to get a foot in the door and get these groups to buy into improving their mental performance, because there's a tangible end result there in terms of competition that everyone wants. And then while you're in there, well, let's also make sure that our mental health is taken care of and that we're putting that as a first priority, because sometimes groups don't want to jump into that conversation, I would think. How do you experience that as a practicing clinician?
Yeah, and I would say that was even our experience introducing mental health and sport and performance psychology with marching health. It started with this idea of, ooh, how can we prepare our minds and our mental state to be better performers? It started with that mental performance and that idea of growing in those skills, which opened that door to, okay, so we can better our best, but what happens when those stressful moments occur? We all go through relationships, family dynamics, social dynamics. One out of every 5 adults have, fit criteria for a mental health diagnosis. So, I mean, we're talking about a large percentage of individuals where, yep, they're maybe in that state to optimize their performance, and then we have, life happens. And then there's this other side where how can we get ourselves to restore? How do we restore and bring ourselves back to that maintenance level of well-being? Because we go through those life changes, those different cycles, those different experiences. So yeah, I would say, even just with marching health is a perfect example of how introducing the mental performance kind of leads to those questions of, well, what do I do if this happens? Or what if I'm not in that mental state to perform? Or what if I'm injured and I'm dealing with those symptoms of fear or self-doubt to come back? Well, that opens that door to, again, being a, mental health clinician. That's where the background is. So to be able to tie that into these same conversations is just, again, I think a benefit to these groups that we're working with, because they cover that spectrum from restoration to optimization.
Absolutely. And I've experienced almost the same categories in my field on the physical health side, where we've got these buckets of injury prevention and also rehabilitating injuries, which is more of the treatment side. And then the other side is performance training, the physical conditioning that's very specific to marching band. It's almost identical to what you're talking about with mental performance versus the mental health side of things. And from that perspective, they complement one another, and we can work together to actually help students improve both at the same time. And I've actually become a better clinician from a physical therapy perspective and from a teaching perspective from having sat in several of your sessions at this point, where some of the surgeons that may send me a patient, or some of the students that get hurt on the band field, their parents start to recognize that their student stays locked in mentally even when they're injured, which can often be the biggest barrier. We used to think in the physical therapy world that if someone tears their ACL or has an ankle sprain, that was very mechanical. It's the nuts and bolts of your joints and your muscles. But one of the biggest factors in someone's ability to return to the field, the marching band field or the drum corps field, is actually their mindset when they're recovering. And I've learned a lot from you and listening into your sessions on just how to keep people in the right mindset and keep them encouraged so that they stay on the right path to recovery. From being in drum corps myself, the hardest part of that was the stress. Being away from home as a young person, not seeing family, not getting to talk to family very often. This is back before iPhones were really that popular. Hey, take it easy, the young Gen Z out there. I wasn't on TikTok all the time, but the loneliness that was, from being away from home, the 12 hours of rehearsal that you had to do a day, the pressures socially for living up to the standards of the drum corps performance-wise. And then you said it earlier, sleep deprivation when you're sleeping in a bus or on a gym floor in the drum corps environment is, that's one of the toughest things mentally to overcome. I was talking to my wife about that earlier because we have 2 sick kids at the moment, and sleep deprivation for the last 4 days has been very difficult to overcome in our house. But that can impact almost every bit of your mental performance, which then impacts your mental health and makes From a physical standpoint, from an injury perspective, people experience pain at higher levels when they're not sleeping. I know that the other side of things that you could speak into is worse when people aren't getting the right rest in between. But I just appreciate all that the doors that you've opened in this regard, because it does complement so much of what we already do. So if you were to give people some advice on say we're talking to band directors, what can they do with students to improve? First, let's talk about their performance mentally. If they want to practice mental skills, what do they do as a band director to help with that?
Well, I think one of the first things band directors can do is just be aware of their audience, be aware of the students that they're working with. I would say across the board, I'd say it seems like most band directors, they deal with this wide range of students that are in front of them day in and day out in the band room. On one side, you have those that are more than invested. Sometimes it might feel like they're more invested than the directors and staff themselves, because they just have this passion that is hard to find sometimes. So on one end, you have students that are more motivated than anybody else, because music, marching, just the arts is what they love to do. It's their passion, and they want to continue that past whatever stage of life they're at. So if it's high school, then college, and then college to making it a career. You also have that other side where they were forced. They didn't want to do choir. You name it. It was the only extracurricular that was available to them, or parents said you have to pick one or the other, and that motivation is going to look different. That drive is going to look different. Then you also have this middle group where it's maybe one way or the other. Some days it's just like, yeah, like this is a really good community. Other days it's like, I have other finals. So I think one of the first things for band directors when it comes to just really trying to bring that community together is just knowing that you have that range, and knowing what that range is and how you're speaking to these individuals. It starts with getting to know them. It's okay if their drive isn't marching band. That's okay. Now, as directors, we would love it if everyone had that full investment. Of course we would. But we don't see that on teams, even at the D1 or even at the professional level. There are those very different levels of passion and motivation for the sport. Marching band is no different. Drum corps is no different. Even with tryouts and the level of competition, that range is no different. So I think for band directors, it really starts with knowing your audience. And then when it comes to driving those motivators, I would guess that it feels pretty easy to, direct or talk or encourage the ones that are fully invested. It's this other side that can be harder to get that buy-in. It starts with trust. It starts with not forcing and saying like, yep, you need to love this just as much as so and so over here. It's just like, hey, look, how can we make this your best experience? Yep. You've even mentioned to me that your parents are forcing you to stay these last 2 years. I know that you feel like it's getting in the way. How can we still make this a good experience for you? So opening that conversation of just being the more real I think directors can be with their students in those one-on-one conversations, that starts to open that door to seeing that performance come out. Because now it's not just about the performance. It's not just being out on the field. It's not just being in the band hall. It's, hey, here's someone that gave me the time. So now their performance is for that director or for that other student, where it's just like, well, they're a good friend of mine. I don't want to let them down, so I'm going to do this for them. So now the values start to come out as well. But again, going back to that first step, it's just who's the audience? How can I build trust depending on what their goals are, and moving it forward from there.
Absolutely. One of the comments we've gotten and biggest questions directors have asked us at all these clinics is, how do I talk to my students, especially young bands, about performance anxiety? Because with the wave of virtual learning, a lot of bands lost members, and they are seeing those effects 2 and 3 and 4 years later and having younger ensembles than maybe they're used to. So what tips do you have for performance anxiety coming in? You mentioned a little bit earlier about just understanding that it's okay first to feel that, right? And then from there, what do you do?
Yeah, I think from there, it's really understanding that when we can feel validated that what we're experiencing is a normal thing, or our body is responding in a normal way, it's what do I want to focus on? I think so often that I hear from athletes, whether it's from a coach or a band director, is a lot of times athletes and performers feel kind of lost because the feedback they receive is, hey, you missed that note there. Hey, you keep missing your set. Yep, right here in the second opening, you went too early. The student knows the mistakes that they're doing. They know. I was like, oh, I know I missed that note. They don't need to hear it 10 times from a section leader or the director or the drum major. They know the mistake. So I think one of the tips that we really try to work on with band directors, staff, leaders, and even business executives is, what do you want to see them do? What's the feedback where it's not about the missing note, it's, hey, why don't you try to think about that phrasing, when we're at set, just try to think about that phrasing here in this moment. It's providing options, it's providing opportunities where they can get better. So often it stops at, hey, stop doing that, stop messing up. I'm sure if they could and they had the ideas and the feedback, they would do everything they could to not make that mistake. So it's kind of one concept that I like to share with a lot of directors or leaders is the difference between praise and affirmations. So now this is kind of going more into that positive side, but a way to kind of keep driving performance is, it's one thing to say, hey, great set out there. It's another thing to say, hey, the way that your musicality here and then nailing your set every time, that's exactly what I want to see. It's more, affirmations are way more specific to what someone has done or what they're doing, versus like those blanket statements of, hey, good job, keep it up, you got this, which are great encouragers, and praise feels good. Pushing that performance, pushing that motivation is, hey, I really see you. What you did there in your warm-ups and your dynamic stretches, like, you're setting the example. Thank you. That affirmation goes way more than a, hey, good job, trumpet section, good job, trombone section. It's pointing out the specifics that you're seeing as a director, and a lot of these young performers, that's what they're holding on to, and then taking it forward.
Yes, and it doesn't matter how long you've been teaching. I need to hear that over and over. Like, once a week, I need Adam in my ear just telling me to point out the positive things and the affirmations, so that we don't, because our brains are going to latch onto that negative. So that when we're trying to get a certain performance out of our students or out of the people around us, that we don't harp on the negative quite as much, and we pull the right performance that we're looking for out of the people around us. One of the things I want to shift to that has become one of my focuses is helping students build more resiliency. And I tell them when we're, oh no, my earplugs are falling out. This is live, y'all. That's what happens. I tell people we use our physical exercises and workouts as a form of helping those students build more willpower and mental resilience. And we do that in the first 10 to 15 minutes of rehearsal, because if we can get a student to, let's take an exercise, let's call it squats. If we can get them to do 10 squats for the first time in their life, or maybe they've never done them before, that's a win for that person. Or maybe we did something that was cardiovascular, and they gave 10 seconds longer to their running endurance to build up for the show. and they had that big goal in mind, and they were willing to push the needle just 1% more every day that they show up to rehearsal. If they're willing to do that every time they show up, just put a little bit more into the tank, then over and over again, that little snowball that starts trickling down the mountain turns into this big avalanche towards them being able to give that much energy into performance itself and give that much energy throughout rehearsal and be able to last throughout long phrases in your show, and then be able to carry that same kind of resilience and focus into the classroom and into their relationships with their friends and at home. So talk to us about what you're seeing in young people right now and how we can help our students become resilient when they face adversity, because it will come.
Yeah. Well, being in the sports psych world, I love all the exercise psychology components as well. And one of the approaches I take with a lot of performers is honestly that exercise piece, exactly what you're saying. We go over the concept of how we talk about exercise being good. Yeah, exercise is good for our body. Yeah, like, all right. Well, what we actually know is exercise stresses the body out. Exercise releases that stress hormone, cortisol, and it's like, wow, like, wait, are you saying exercise is bad? No. Exercise trains the body and trains the mind to better handle adversity when it hits, when it's not something that we're in control of. So when we do those 10 squats and we stress the body out, it's our actions and our behavior that are spiking those cortisol levels, that are spiking those stress levels, and then we can help bring ourselves down. When we're done with that workout, heart rate naturally drops, our body starts to relax and repair itself for that next workout. So we're basically training the body to handle stress. So when those moments that are out of our control, like, oh, time change, you got to get to practice 45 minutes early, and there's that sense of panic. Well, that spike of stress now becomes more of a routine. It's like, okay, I've dealt with this before. I've gone through those dynamic warm-ups. I've gone through those high intensity interval training exercises. I've been doing the work. So when those spikes happen out of our control, the body and the mind is in a better position to handle those, because exercise is one of those components that trains the body to handle those spikes when they occur. So it's not the most traditional cognitive behavioral route to therapy per se, but when
Right.
it comes to being more mentally resilient, I mean, we have to bring in the physical component. When we can bring that in and introduce those concepts in a different way, so maybe their focus is on something other than the pain that they feel in their squats. So maybe we're talking about a squat drill where they're focused on their horn angle. As you know, Elliot, like when we talk about injury, like rehab or injury prevention, when the mind is focused on these different tasks, you're probably hearing less complaints from the physical side of that lower body pain. You know that they're physically healthy to engage, but their mind, when that self-doubt is on that part of the body, they might stop earlier, they might complain about the pain. But when we can help them refocus and still engage that part of the body, it's almost like it's a completely different conversation. So
Yes.
I think when it comes to the mental resilience, a big piece is that physical component. And that's why it's been so enjoyable doing these clinics, because we can bring that in. We can bring both of these pieces. We can bring the mental side to the dynamic warm-ups. We can bring the physical side to building mental resilience. And we kind of are able to, collaborate and bring those concepts together, because it truly is the mind-body connection.
Absolutely. The last thing I want to ask you is about what I think is termed pre-framing, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea of presenting something before it happens. So when I used to go teach these clinics by myself and things would get difficult physically, and I had not said at the beginning of the clinic how challenging some parts of it might feel for new members of the band who may have never exercised before, honestly, then we'd have 5 to 10 kids drop out, not quit band, but just stop working out with us and just kind of sit on the sidelines. Then about 2 years ago, I had this idea that I need to put this out in front of the clinic. And so you experienced a little bit of that with some of the mantras that we say in these clinics, and we get them to buy into. And we do that if the group is right. The concepts like that there's going to be some suffering involved here. Maybe we got to embrace the suck a little bit, that this is going to be a challenging clinic physically. And when we get them to buy into that up front and do it in a fun way, we stop seeing students drop out. They just push through and they learn really fast, and they almost see these instantaneous results of what we're talking about with mental resiliency just by having a little bit of information ahead of time to know what sensations they're supposed to feel, what things their body is supposed to go through. And that can be an incredible teaching tool for everything else we ask our students to do if we just give them the expectations up front. So last thing is just, what are your comments on that idea of pre-framing and just giving information to our students before even a big performance on what they should feel like and visualize?
You're talking about providing the education, so there is that awareness of what to expect. The mind doesn't like the unexpected, but the mind really doesn't like surprises. The mind doesn't like when things out of the ordinary happen, or when unexpected changes to our schedule, or maybe to our physical health or wellness. Like when we feel that soreness, it's like, oh my gosh, what just happened? We don't like surprises. So what was so fun to watch is, what did I have to do with building mental resilience? It was great. Like the first 20 minutes of all these clinics, it was like, yeah, embrace the suck. Like, hey, here's a challenge you can expect. I'm going to put it out there right now, but you know what? Let's roll with it. Can I get everyone to buy in right now, where we're just going to embrace the suck? And then, 100 performers are just yelling that. And then they're out in, when we're down in Texas and it's already like 85, 90 degrees at 8 in the morning, and they're outside in that humidity going, it's not Dr. Elliot saying, hey, embrace the suck. It's that student over there, or that student in the back, or students up front. They're yelling it throughout all these exercises because they're feeling the soreness, but in their mind it's like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to feel this. This is supposed to be a challenge. Yeah, I'm going to embrace it. I'm going to make my whole section embrace it right now. So now it's coming from them. So it really does start with, being real, being open. Like, let's be transparent. This is probably what some of you are going to experience. Let's embrace it. Yeah, I'm going to throw it out there right now. You might not like it, but it's going to be beneficial. So let's do it. I love the presentation, and that's just bringing the education, being transparent up front to get that trust. I think on the other side is also helping athletes and performers recognize our mind is constantly going. It's always going to have thoughts. Our thoughts are automatic. We can't choose what to think or what not to think about. It's just going to think about certain things as we're talking here. Right now, it's just like, oh yeah, like I definitely want to eat something after this, podcast. My mind's automatically going there. I'm trying to stay focused. I'm being present. It's not my brain's fault that I'm thinking about food right now. It's going to go there. Thoughts just happen. But when we can kind of separate the difference between automatic thoughts and what we focus on being a choice, having that separation, it kind of helps us also prepare for challenges in that sense as well. So I may think, oh my gosh, I'm sore. I haven't done jumping jacks. Like, what are other people going to be thinking about me when I do these lunges or squats? Like, I'm not that athletic. Our mind might go to those thoughts. Our mind might go to that place. And yet, how can we still make that choice of, yep, I'm allowed to have these thoughts and feelings, and I can still choose to do blank. I can still choose to put myself out there. I can still choose to act and behave in this way. My feelings and thoughts don't have to dictate my actions. So trying to also teach that alongside with the education and presenting challenges and being transparent kind of covers that in a holistic way as well.
My feelings and thoughts don't have to dictate my actions. That's a good one to end on right there. Boom.
That's it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the time. One, Tim Hinton, thank you for letting us talk about the work we've been doing. But
100%.
Tim, are there questions you have for us as I plug in to keep my charge on the ending?
What's happened is I've been sitting here taking notes, and I think this is such a fascinating conversation. And a lot of times things that I wrote down, you guys turned right back around and addressed later. And so I don't want to take you too far afield with any other questions, but I do feel like you answered the main things that I wanted to hear. And I just think it was so interesting. Some basic concepts that I think people who have heard this, what I love about it is it's all like, yeah, that's, everybody can buy into that. Like, that makes sense. It's not like big crazy concepts, but like, oh yeah, I can see how that could help me. That's what I love about the approach you guys are taking to sort of all the work you're doing. And I think that was very clear tonight. So Elliot, if they want to learn more about all this stuff, try to get you for a clinic or make sure they find your resources, where do they go?
Please go to our website, www.marchinghealth.com, or email me, elliot@marchinghealth.com. Elliot, 2 L's, 1 T, ELLIOT @marchinghealth.com. We've had a tragedy recently of having Instagram delete us. So all 42,000 followers and all that is no longer a thing. We're trying to rebuild it. It is @marchinghealthofficial if you want to follow the new Instagram. But for right now, the safest way to reach me is elliot@marchinghealth.com. And we would love to be able to work with you. We're booking out already. Adam and I have been discussing different flight patterns for the summer, where we've got several school districts and individual schools, as well as several drum corps involved with that we're going to be helping and trying to take them to the next level and keep their performers at their best all year.
That's great. Adam, anything you want to say before we go?
No, just Tim, again, really appreciate you having us on, and Elliot, it's always a pleasure to have these conversations outside of the clinics, because it just gets me excited. It's like, oh yeah, we have a lot that we need to figure out for the summer. So likewise, I would say, easiest way to get in touch would be marchinghealth.com. And Elliot, we're gonna have to talk about this whole Instagram thing. I was not aware of that. So we got.
Yeah. It's bad. It's rough. It's just gone, deleted. Once the metaverse removes you, you're gone. So I got hacked on my personal page a year ago, and then they deleted my business page too. Facebook is still there. The Marching Health Facebook still exists, and the Marching Health TikTok and YouTube pages and Twitter pages are still up too. But we're trying to rebuild, and the number one thing those platforms are is a tool for building relationships. And so the biggest thing is that we still find ways to build relationships with the performers and build relationships with band directors who will be teaching them and educating them and influencing the next generation. So find a way to get in touch with me with the mediums I've told you, because I'd love to touch base and get to know you.
Well, Elliot and Adam, great job. This was such an interesting conversation. I mean, I could sit here and talk for a bunch more about some other questions I had about things you said, but I'm sure that there are ways that I can learn that by going to your site and checking out all your resources. So thank you for taking time to do this tonight. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Tim, for having us.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.